Sometimes loneliness cuts deeper than any physical wound, especially when you've buried the people you loved most. At 60 years old, wealthy rancher Barrett McCord had everything money could buy but nothing that mattered to the heart. In 1880's New Mexico territory, he made a desperate decision to order a mail-order bride, hoping a young woman might bring life back to his empty ranch house. What arrived instead was Clara May Dawson, a 40-year-old widow who had faced her own share of heartbreak. She didn't come to be a decoration or a servant. She came with quiet strength, gentle wisdom, and a stubborn refusal to let a good man waste away in his grief. Clara brought hymns at sunset, home-cooked meals, and the kind of patient love that heals old wounds. Would a man who had given up on living allow himself to be saved by a woman who refused to give up on him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never quite settled on the McCord ranch. It danced in the late afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows of the main house, swirling like memories that refused to rest. Barrett McCord stood at those windows now, watching his hands move cattle across the distant pastures, his weathered fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 60, Bear McCord carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had learned that life could strip away everything precious without warning. His shoulders, broad as a barn door, bore the weight of 30 years, running the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Silver streaked his dark hair and lined his sun-weathered face, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once sparked with laughter, held the hollow look of a man who had buried too much of his heart. The ranch house itself seemed to echo his loneliness. Built 25 years ago when his dreams ran as wide as the New Mexico sky, it boasted 12 rooms, hand-carved mahogany railings, and a grand staircase that spiraled up to bedrooms that remained forever empty. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes decorated walls that rarely heard conversation. It was a house built for a family, for children's laughter and holiday gatherings, for the kind of life that existed now only in Barrett's increasingly distant memories. His first wife, Margaret, had lived to see only 3 years in this house. Consumption took her during the harsh winter of 1863, leaving Barrett with rooms full of her carefully chosen furniture and the lingering scent of her lavender sachets. He had loved her with the passionate intensity of a young man, and her death had nearly broken him. But grief, he learned, was a luxury a rancher could not afford. Cattle needed tending, men needed wages, and the ranch demanded its due regardless of personal sorrow. 5 years later, loneliness had driven him to marry again. Sarah brought different gifts her, quick wit, capable hands, and a warmth that slowly began to heal the frozen places in his heart. For 7 years, she filled the house with her energy, her humming in the kitchen, her gentle corrections when he tracked mud across her clean floors. Sarah understood ranch life, understood the long hours and hard seasons. She even understood, with infinite patience, Barrett's struggles with reading and writing skills that had seemed unnecessary to a boy raised on horseback and cattle drives. Then typhoid fever swept through the territory in 1875, claiming Sarah and dozens of others in a matter of weeks. Barrett buried her next to Margaret on the hill overlooking the valley, and something in him died with her. The house fell silent again, but this time the silence felt permanent. He was 47 years old and twice widowed, convinced that love was a young man's game and that he had played his final hand. That was 13 years ago. 13 years of meals eaten alone, of conversations limited to ranch business, of evenings spent staring into the fire with only his thoughts for company. The ranch prospered under his careful management, now owned 30,000 acres and ran 15,000 head of cattle, but prosperity felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. His hands respected him but worried about him. Tom Martinez, his foreman for 20 years, had taken to lingering after the evening reports, clearly wanting to say something but never finding the words. The younger hands spoke in hushed tones about their boss's increasing isolation, how he rarely joined them for meals anymore, how he seemed to fade a little more each year. It was Tom who had finally broached the subject on a cold February evening, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the floor of Barrett's study. "Boss, you mind if I speak plain?" Barrett had looked up from his ledgers, noting the uncomfortable set of Tom's shoulders. "Always have, Tom. Not about to ask you to stop now." "You're dying, Mr. McCord. Not sick dying, but dying all the same. This ranch, it's got everything a man could want except the one thing that matters most." Tom's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "A ranch needs a woman's touch. A man needs a woman's touch, and you, well, you've been without too long." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Barrett had wanted to argue, to dismiss Tom's concerns with the gruff authority he usually wielded, but the truth of it settled in his chest like a stone. He was dying, slowly and quietly, withering away in the midst of his success. That conversation had planted the seed that grew into a decision Barrett never thought he would make. After weeks of wrestling with his pride and his fears, he had written to a matrimonial agency in Kansas City. The letter had been laboriously crafted, each word chosen with the care of a man who struggled with written communication. He had described his ranch, his circumstances, his need for a wife who could manage a household and provide companionship. He had not mentioned his age, his inability to read well, or the ghosts that haunted his grand house. The response had been encouraging. They had several suitable candidates, young women seeking adventure and security in the West. Barrett had chosen Clara May Dawson based on little more than a brief description. 25 years old, widow, skilled in housekeeping, seeking a fresh start. The photograph that accompanied her letter showed a pretty woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She would arrive on the Thursday stage, the letter confirmed, ready to begin a new life as Mrs. Barrett McCord. But the woman who stepped down from the dusty stagecoach bore little resemblance to the photograph he carried in his vest pocket. Clara May Dawson was older 40 if she was a day, with streaks of silver in her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of sorrows faced and overcome. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to depend on her own strength, and her eyes held depths that reminded Barrett uncomfortably of his own reflection. Her luggage was modest, a single battered trunk, and a smaller case that she clutched protectively. She wore a simple blue dress, well made but showing signs of careful mending, and a bonnet that had seen better days. Everything about her spoke of genteel poverty, of someone who had once known better circumstances and had learned to make do with less. "Mr. McCord?" Her voice was softer than he had expected, with a slight accent that spoke of education and refinement. "I'm Clara May Dawson." Barrett found himself at a loss for words. This was not the young, pliable woman he had expected. This was someone with her own history, her own sorrows, her own strength. He felt suddenly foolish, an old man who had tried to purchase companionship like a new saddle or a prize bull. "Mrs. Dawson." He touched his hat, his manners falling back on formal politeness. "Welcome to New Mexico." She studied his face with a directness that was both unsettling and somehow comforting. "I know I'm not what you expected, Mr. McCord. The photograph was taken some years ago, and I perhaps was not entirely forthcoming about my age. If you wish to send me back on the next stage, I will understand." Her honesty caught him off guard. In a world where people often said what they thought others wanted to hear, her straightforward acknowledgement of the deception, however, mild, was refreshing. "The next stage doesn't come through until Monday," he said finally. "Perhaps we should get to know each other first." Something that might have been relief flickered across her features. "That seems wise, Mr. McCord. Very wise indeed." As they rode toward the ranch house in Barrett's buggy, Clara May Dawson began to reveal herself in small ways. She commented on the beauty of the landscape, the vastness of the sky, the health of the cattle they passed. Her observations were intelligent and showed a genuine appreciation for the land. She asked thoughtful questions about the ranch operation, about the challenges of running such a large spread, about the men who worked for him. When they reached the house, Clara stood for a long moment, taking in its grandeur. Barrett found himself seeing it through her eyes, the carefully crafted exterior, the wide porch with its intricate woodwork, the multiple chimneys that spoke of warmth and comfort within. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "It must have taken great care to build something so fine." Barrett felt an unexpected warmth at her words. "My late wife helped design it. She had particular ideas about how a house should look. She had excellent taste." Clara's voice held no trace of jealousy or discomfort at the mention of his previous marriages. "I can see love in every detail." As they entered the house, Barrett watched Clara's reaction to the interior. Her eyes took in the fine furniture, the rich carpets, the crystal chandelier that caught the afternoon light. But rather than showing awe or calculation, her expression was one of gentle appreciation, as if she understood that these beautiful things were meant to be lived with, not merely admired. "I have a housekeeper who comes in twice a week," Barrett explained, suddenly self-conscious about the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the slightly neglected air that hung about the room. "Maria keeps things clean, but the house has been quiet for a long time." Clara nodded, her weathered hands running gently across the back of a chair. "Houses need more than cleaning, Mr. McCord. They need living in. They need to feel valued and cherished." She looked up at him with those perceptive eyes. "Much like people, I suppose." Her words hit closer to home than Barrett was comfortable with. He cleared his throat, gestured toward the stairs. "I'll show you to your room. You can rest before dinner. We eat at 6. As they climbed the elegant staircase, Barrett found himself acutely aware of Clara's presence beside him. She moved with quiet grace, her hand trailing lightly along the banister, her eyes taking in the family portraits that lined the walls. When they reached the guest room, a spacious chamber with windows overlooking the valley, she turned to him with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Mr. McCord. This is lovely, more than I could have hoped for." Barrett nodded curtly, suddenly eager to escape the intimacy of the moment. "Dinner at 6, he repeated, and left her to settle in. That evening, as he sat across from Clara May Dawson at his dining table, Barrett realized that his carefully ordered world was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. She was not the young, malleable woman he had expected. She was something far more complex, far more interesting, and far more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. The question that haunted him as he watched her eat with quiet enjoyment was whether he was brave enough to let her try to save him, or whether he would retreat into the safety of his loneliness, sending her away before she could hurt him, the way life had hurt him before. Outside, the New Mexico wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the beginning of something that would transform them both. The morning after Clara's arrival dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of the ranch house. Barrett rose before sunrise, as had been his custom for 40 years, and made his way to the kitchen to start the coffee. He found Clara already there, moving quietly around the unfamiliar space, her worn hymnal open on the counter beside her as she hummed something soft and spiritual under her breath. "Good morning, Mr. McCord," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I'm an early riser by nature, and I thought I might make myself useful." Barrett stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. Clara had found the flour and eggs, and biscuits were already rising in the oven. The coffee smelled stronger and richer than his usual bitter brew, and she had somehow located his mother's good china, setting 2 places at the small kitchen table rather than the formal dining room. "You didn't need to," he began, but she turned to face him with a gentle smile that silenced his protest. "Everyone needs to eat, Mr. McCord, and I find cooking helps me think." She poured coffee into a delicate cup, adding just a touch of cream. "Besides, a kitchen should be the heart of a home. It's been too quiet for too long." As they ate her excellent biscuits with honey and butter, Barrett found himself stealing glances at Clara. In the morning light, he could see the care with which she had arranged her simple possessions around the kitchen: her hymnal, a small wooden cross, a faded photograph of a young man in work clothes. These items spoke of a woman who carried her faith and her memories with her, who created home wherever she landed. "The biscuits are very good," he said, surprised by how much he was enjoying the simple meal. "My grandmother's recipe," Clara replied. "She always said that food prepared with love tastes different than food prepared out of duty. I've found that to be true." After breakfast, Barrett retreated to his study to review the ranch ledgers and prepare for the day's work. This was his sanctuary, lined with books he couldn't read and papers that represented years of careful management. He spread the account books across his desk, squinting at the columns of numbers that told the story of his business success. The knock on his door came an hour later, soft but insistent. "Mr. McCord, I was wondering if I might speak with you." Clara entered when he called permission, carrying a tray with fresh coffee and a plate of leftover biscuits. She set it on the corner of his desk, her eyes taking in the ledgers and papers spread before him. "I don't mean to interrupt your work," she said carefully, "but I noticed you seem to be having some difficulty with the accounts." Barrett's jaw tightened. "The accounts are fine, Mrs. Dawson. I've been managing them for 30 years. But even as he spoke, he could feel heat rising in his cheeks. The truth was that the numbers had been getting harder to decipher, the letters seeming to dance and blur before his eyes. He had developed elaborate workarounds over the years, having Tom read important correspondence aloud, memorizing the signatures of business associates, relying on his phenomenal memory for figures and facts. But the written word remained his enemy, a shameful secret he guarded more carefully than his money. Clara moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. McCord, forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but I was a schoolteacher before I married. I know the signs of someone who struggles with reading. There's no shame in it more common than you might think, especially among men of your generation who were needed for work rather than schooling." Barrett's face flushed crimson. He started to rise, to order her from his study, to retreat behind the walls of pride and authority that had protected him for so long. But something in Clara's tone stopped him, not pity, not condescension, but simple understanding. "I don't know what you think you see," he said stiffly, "but I assure you—" "You're holding that ledger upside down," Clara said gently. Barrett looked down and realized she was right. The shame that washed over him was so intense it took his breath away. Here he was, a man who commanded respect across 3 territories, who had built an empire from nothing, and he couldn't even hold a book properly. The humiliation burned in his throat like bad whiskey. Clara sat down in the chair across from his desk, her movements careful and deliberate. "My husband couldn't read either when I married him. Brilliant man could look at a piece of land and tell you exactly what it would yield, could diagnose a sick animal with just a glance, but put a newspaper in front of him, and he was lost." "What did you do?" The words escaped before Barrett could stop them. "I taught him," Clara said simply, "started with simple words, then sentences, then paragraphs. It took time and patience, but by the end of our marriage, he could read the Bible aloud to our son every evening." Her voice caught slightly at the memory. "It became one of our greatest joys together." Barrett stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that he hadn't expected, not pity or superiority, but genuine warmth and understanding. "You would be willing to? That is, if someone wanted to learn." "I would consider it an honor," Clara said firmly. "Learning to read is never too late, Mr. McCord. The desire to learn is all that's required." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear. Barrett had carried the burden of his illiteracy for 60 years, had built elaborate defenses around it, had convinced himself it didn't matter as long as he could manage his business and command his men. But sitting across from this woman, who offered help without judgment, he felt something crack open inside his chest, longing he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed. "I don't want the men to know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Of course not," Clara agreed. "This would be between us. Private lessons, perhaps in the evenings after your work is done." Barrett nodded slowly, still hardly believing he was agreeing to this. "We could start with the basics, I suppose, the alphabet and such." Clara's smile was radiant. "We'll start wherever you're comfortable, Mr. McCord. There's no rush, no pressure, just the joy of discovering new worlds through words. That afternoon, as Barrett went about his ranch duties, he found his mind returning again and again to Clara's offer. The prospect of finally conquering the written word both thrilled and terrified him. What if he was too old? What if his mind couldn't grasp what children learned so easily? What if Clara grew frustrated with his slowness and abandoned the effort? But underneath the fear, something else was growing hope. The same hope he had felt 30 years ago when he first saw this land and dreamed of what it could become. Clara had looked at his struggle and seen not weakness but potential. She had offered her help not as charity but as a gift freely given. When he returned to the house that evening, he found Clara in the parlor, her hymnal open in her lap as she hummed quietly to herself. The sound was peaceful, comforting in a way that made him realize how much he had missed having music in his home. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway, "about this morning what we discussed." She looked up, her eyes bright with encouragement. "Yes, Mr. McCord? If the offer still stands, I think I would like to try. To learn, I mean." Clara's face lit up with such genuine pleasure that Barrett felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "Oh, Mr. McCord, I'm so glad. We'll make a fine student of you. Mark my words." As she closed her hymnal and rose to prepare for their first lesson, Barrett realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Clara Mae Dawson was no longer just the mail-order bride who had arrived under false pretenses. She was becoming something far more valuable and far more dangerous. She was becoming someone he trusted. And for a man who had learned to trust no one but himself, that was the most terrifying and wonderful development he could imagine. The evening light slanted through the windows of the parlor as Clara gathered her teaching materials, and Barrett McCord prepared to embark on a journey that would change not just his ability to read, but his entire understanding of what it meant to let someone care for him. Outside, the cattle lowed softly in the distance, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of transformation and the sweet possibility of redemption. The first reading lesson took place 3 evenings later, after Barrett had spent 2 days wrestling with his pride and his fears. Clara had suggested they begin in the study, where he felt most comfortable, and she had arranged 2 chairs near the window, where the last light of day could supplement the oil lamp's glow. Barrett sat stiffly in his leather chair, feeling more nervous than he had on his wedding days. Clara had brought her materialza, simple primer, some paper, and a collection of children's books that made him feel foolish just looking at them. But her manner was so gentle, so matter-of-fact, that some of his tension began to ease. "We'll start with something that already has meaning for you," Clara said, opening a worn leather book that Barrett recognized immediately. "This is your mother's Bible, isn't it? I found it on the shelf, and I thought we might begin with familiar words." Barrett's throat tightened. His mother's Bible had been one of his most treasured possessions since her death 30 years ago, but it had remained essentially decorative, a beautiful object he could hold but never truly access. The thought of finally being able to read her favorite passages, to understand the words that had comforted her during her final illness, was almost overwhelming. "She used to read to me from this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Psalms mostly. She said they brought her peace." Clara opened to the 23rd Psalm, her finger tracing beneath the familiar words. "Let's start here then. Can you make out any letters you recognize?" For the next hour, Clara guided him through the basics with infinite patience. She showed him how the letters formed words, how words built sentences, how the mysterious markings on the page could transform into meaning. Barrett's large, calloused hands fumbled with the pencil as he practiced writing his own name, the letters looking childish and uneven compared to Clara's elegant script. "Don't worry about making it perfect," Clara encouraged when he muttered in frustration. "My husband's first attempts looked like chicken scratches. The important thing is to keep trying." As the days passed, their evening lessons became a cherished routine. Barrett found himself looking forward to them with an anticipation that surprised him. Clara's presence in his study transformed the space from a place of solitary struggle into something warmer, more alive. She would arrive each evening with fresh coffee, and sometimes a plate of whatever she had baked that day, settling into her chair with the same calm acceptance she brought to everything else. The ranch hands began to notice changes in their boss, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what was different. Tom Martinez commented to the other men that Mr. McCord seemed less isolated, more likely to join in conversation during the evening meal. There was something lighter about him, as if a burden he had carried for years was finally beginning to lift. Clara, meanwhile, had begun to make her mark on the household in ways both subtle and profound. She worked alongside Maria, the housekeeper, learning the rhythms of the ranch while quietly improving them. The meals became more varied and flavorful. Fresh flowers appeared on the tables. The curtains were opened wider to let in more light. Small repairs that had been ignored for months were suddenly attended to with quiet efficiency. But it was in the evenings, during their private lessons, that the real transformation was taking place. Barrett was discovering that learning to read was about more than just deciphering letters and words. It was about opening doorways to new worlds, new ideas, new ways of understanding himself and his place in the larger story of life. Sound it out slowly. Clara encouraged one evening as Barrett struggled with a particularly difficult word in the Book of Psalms. Break it down into smaller pieces. Righteousness, 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 Barrett repeated, the word feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. I've heard preachers use that word hundreds of times, but seeing it written out. He paused, marveling at the connection between sound and symbol. It makes it more real somehow. Clara smiled, her face soft in the lamplight. That's exactly right, Mr. McCord. Reading doesn't just give us information, it gives us deeper understanding. It's why I've always believed that literacy is one of the greatest gifts we can give or receive. As Barrett's skills slowly improved, Clara began sharing stories of her previous life. She spoke of the one-room schoolhouse where she had taught, of the children who had struggled just as Barrett was struggling now, of the joy she had felt when they finally grasped a difficult concept. Her voice would grow warm and animated when she talked about teaching, and Barrett could see glimpses of the younger woman she had once been. "You must miss it," he said one evening after she had finished telling him about a student who had gone on to become a doctor. "Teaching, I mean." Clara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her mother's Bible. "I do miss it," she admitted, "but life takes us down different paths than we expect. When I married my first husband, women teachers were expected to give up their positions. It was considered improper for a married woman to work outside the home." "That seems wasteful," Barrett said, the words coming out more forcefully than he had intended. "You have a gift for it. I've never had anyone explain things so clearly, so patiently." Clara looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. McCord. It means more than you know." Their conversations began to extend beyond the lessons themselves. Barrett found himself telling Clara about his childhood, about his father, who had died when Barrett was barely 15, leaving him to run the ranch and care for his ailing mother. He spoke of the early struggles, the years when the ranch barely broke even, the gradual accumulation of land and cattle that had eventually made him wealthy. "You must have been very lonely," Clara observed one evening after he had finished telling her about his mother's death. "Taking on so much responsibility so young, with no time for the usual pursuits of young men." Barrett nodded slowly. "I suppose I was, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. There was always too much work to be done, too many people depending on me. Loneliness seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford." "And now?" Clara asked gently. Barrett met her eyes across the small table where their books lay open. "Now I'm beginning to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. They're not the same thing at all." As the weeks passed, Barrett began to notice other changes in himself beyond his growing literacy. He slept better, woke with more energy, found himself humming as he went about his work. The house felt different too, warmer and more welcoming. Clara's presence had somehow brought it back to life, filling the empty spaces with purpose and gentle activity. One evening, as Barrett successfully read an entire verse from Psalms without help, Clara clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, Mr. McCord, that was beautiful. You read it with such feeling, such understanding." Barrett felt heat rise in his cheeks at her praise, but it was a good heat, the warmth of accomplishment rather than shame. "I've been listening to those words in my head for 30 years, he said. "Being able to see them on the page, to read them myself, it's like finding something I didn't know I had lost." Clara reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture so spontaneous and warm that it sent an unexpected jolt through Barrett's entire being. "That's exactly what learning should feel like," she said softly. "Like coming home to yourself." As Barrett lay in bed that night, Clara's words echoed in his mind. Coming home to yourself. For the first time in 13 years, he felt as though he might be doing exactly that. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Clara broached a subject that made Barrett's jaw clench with familiar resistance. They were sitting on the front porch after their evening lesson, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, when she mentioned her desire to plant fruit trees on the property. "I was thinking about the area near the kitchen garden," Clara said, her voice carefully casual as she rocked slowly in the chair Barrett had brought out for her. "It gets good morning sun and has that natural windbreak from the cottonwoods. Peach trees would do well there, I think. Maybe some apple trees, too." Barrett's hands stilled on the arms of his own chair. "Fruit trees take years to mature, Mrs. Dawson, years to produce anything worthwhile." "Yes," Clara agreed peacefully. 3 to 5 years for peaches, a bit longer for apples, but imagine the satisfaction of eating fruit from trees you planted yourself. And think of the preserves we could make, the pies." She trailed off, seeming to sense his discomfort. The silence stretched between them, filled with the evening sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of a coyote. Barrett struggled with emotions he couldn't quite name. The idea of planting trees for the future, of assuming there would be a future, that he would still be here to see them bear fruit, felt presumptuous and terrifying in equal measure. "I've learned not to plan too far ahead," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Life has a way of taking away what you think you can count on." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes gentle but determined. "Life also has a way of surprising us with gifts we never expected. Sometimes we have to plant in faith, trusting that good things can grow even when we can't see the end result." Barrett wanted to argue, to explain why hope was dangerous, why planning for the future was a fool's game. But something in Clara's tone made him hold back. There was sadness in her voice, but also a stubborn optimism that spoke of her own losses overcome. "You've lost people too," he said instead, making it a statement rather than a question. Clara nodded slowly. "My husband died of pneumonia 7 years ago. Our son," her voice caught slightly, "our son died of fever the year before that. He was only 16. Barrett felt something twist in his chest. He had known she was a widow, but the mention of a childer son lost so young added a dimension to her grief that made his own losses feel less unique, less isolating. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have asked before. About your family." "It's not something I talk about easily," Clara admitted, "but it's why I understand your reluctance to plan too far ahead. After losing them, I wondered if it was worth investing my heart in anything again, if it was safer to simply exist rather than truly live." "What changed your mind?" Clara was quiet for so long that Barrett thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I realized that my husband and son wouldn't want me to stop living because they were gone. They would want me to plant trees, to make preserves, to believe in tomorrow. Honoring their memory means continuing to hope, not shutting myself away from all possibility of joy." Barrett absorbed her words, feeling them settle into the places where his own grief had hardened into protective barriers. "It's easier to plan for today than to dream about next year." "Yes," Clara agreed. "But easier isn't always better. Sometimes we have to choose courage over ease, hope over safety." The next morning, Barrett found Clara in the kitchen garden, measuring distances with careful steps and making notes on a piece of paper. Her movements were purposeful but unhurried, as if she were already seeing the mature trees in her mind's eye. "Still thinking about those peach trees?" he asked, joining her in the morning sunlight. Clara looked up with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I am. I know you think it's foolish, but I can't help imagining how beautiful this spot would be in spring, with the trees in bloom. And the practical benefits: fresh fruit, preserves for winter, maybe even enough extra to sell at market." Barrett found himself studying the area through her eyes, trying to envision the changes she described. It had been so long since he had thought beyond the immediate needs of the ranch, beyond the next season's challenges. "How many trees were you thinking?" he heard himself ask. Clara's expression brightened with hope. 6 peach trees, perhaps 4 apple. Enough to make a difference, but not so many as to overwhelm the space. She hesitated, then added, "Of course, it would be your decision entirely, Mr. McCord. This is your land." Barrett walked the perimeter of the proposed orchard, his boots crunching on the frost-touched grass. The area did receive good sun, and the windbreak from the existing trees would protect young saplings from the harsh winter winds that swept down from the mountains. It was, he had to admit, a sensible location for fruit trees. But more than the practical considerations, he found himself responding to Clara's quiet enthusiasm, her ability to see potential where he saw only empty ground. When had he stopped dreaming about improvements to the ranch beyond mere maintenance and survival? "We'd need to order the saplings soon if we want to plant in early spring," he said, surprising himself with the words. Clara's face lit up with such joy that Barrett felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. "Oh, Mr. McCord, do you really think so? You're willing to try?" "I'm willing to consider it," Barrett said carefully, but he couldn't quite suppress the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. "We could write to the nursery in Denver, see what varieties they recommend for this climate." "We could," Clara agreed, her voice dancing with excitement. "And while we're waiting for spring, we could prepare the soil, maybe build a small fence to protect them from rabbits and deer." As they walked back toward the house, Barrett found himself caught up in Clara's planning despite his reservations. She spoke of composting kitchen scraps to enrich the soil, of the best methods for protecting young trees from late frosts, of the satisfaction of preserving fruit from their own land. "You seem to know quite a bit about fruit trees," Barrett observed. "My father kept an orchard when I was growing up," Clara explained, "small but productive. Some of my happiest childhood memories are of helping him tend those trees, of the excitement each spring when the blossoms appeared, of picking the first ripe peaches of summer." Barrett listened to the warmth in her voice and found himself envying those childhood memories. His own youth had been consumed with the practical demands of ranching, with little time for the gentler pleasures Clara described. That evening, during their reading lesson, Barrett managed to get through an entire chapter of Genesis without help, the story of creation and growth taking on new meaning as he thought about Clara's proposed orchard. "You've made remarkable progress," Clara said as they closed the Bible. "I think you're ready to try reading something on your own, perhaps a letter or a simple book." Barrett felt a surge of pride at her words, followed immediately by an idea that surprised him with its boldness. "What if we wrote to that nursery together? You could help me compose the letter, and I could practice my writing." Clara's smile was radiant. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mr. McCord. A perfect way to combine your new skills with planning for the future." As they prepared the writing materials, Barrett realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, Clara had begun to make him believe in tomorrow again. The orchard had become more than just fruit trees. It had become a symbol of faith in the future, a declaration that life was worth more than mere survival. And perhaps most surprising of all, Barrett was beginning to think Clara might be right. The trouble began on a grey November morning when Barrett received visitors he hadn't expected and didn't want. He was reviewing cattle counts with Tom when Clara appeared at the barn door, her face tight with concern. "Mr. McCord, there are 3 men at the house asking for you. They seem insistent." Barrett looked up from his ledger, noting the tension in Clara's voice. "What kind of men?" Well-dressed, but hard-looking, the kind who carry themselves like they're used to getting their way. They wouldn't state their business to me, said it was ranch business that required speaking to the owner directly. Barrett exchanged a look with Tom, who had worked the territory long enough to recognize trouble when it came calling. "Stay with the men," Barrett told his foreman. "Keep them busy with the morning work. I'll handle this." As they walked back to the house, Clara fell into step beside him, her mending basket tucked under her arm, a habit she had developed of keeping her hands busy during times of uncertainty. "I didn't like the way they looked at the house," she said quietly, like they were measuring it for value rather than admiring its beauty. Barrett felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. In 30 years of ranching, he had learned to recognize the signs of approaching conflict, and Clara's instincts were proving as sharp as his own. The three men waiting in his parlor confirmed his worst suspicions. They were representatives of the Territorial Development Company, a consortium of investors from back east who had been buying up ranch land throughout New Mexico with promises of bringing the railroad through. Their leader, a thin man named Hartwell with calculating eyes and soft hands, smiled with practiced charm as he outlined their proposal. "Mr. McCord, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your holdings. $35,000 for the entire spreadland, cattle, buildings, everything. It's more than fair market value, I assure you." Barrett kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was calculating. 35,000 was indeed generous too, generous for a simple land purchase. "What makes my land so valuable to your company, Mr. Hartwell?" "The railroad, of course. We have it on good authority that the Santa Fe line will be extended through this valley within the next 5 years. Land values will triple, maybe quadruple. We're offering you the chance to profit now, rather than wait for uncertain future developments." It was a smooth presentation, delivered with the confidence of men who were used to getting what they wanted. But Barrett had survived 3 decades in a harsh land by trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him these men were not what they seemed. "I appreciate your offer," Barrett said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling. This ranch has been my life's work. I'm not ready to walk away from it." Hartwell's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Perhaps you'd like some time to consider our proposal, Mr. McCord. Discuss it with your wife." His gaze shifted to Clara, who had entered the room carrying a tray of coffee, and Barrett didn't like the way the man's eyes lingered on her. "There's nothing to discuss," Barrett said firmly. "The ranch is not for sale." After the men left, Barrett found himself pacing his study while Clara sat quietly in her chair, her mending in her lap, but her hands still. The visit had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, not just because of the pressure to sell, but because of the subtle threat he had sensed beneath their polite words. "You don't trust them," Clara observed. It wasn't a question. "Men like that don't offer generous prices out of kindness," Barrett replied. "They know something they're not telling me, and they want this land badly enough to pay well over market value for it." Clara set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "What will you do?" Barrett appreciated that she asked what he would do, not what they should do. Despite the growing intimacy between them, she respected that this was his decision to make, his land to protect or surrender. "I'll wire my contact at the territorial office, ask some questions about this development company and their railroad claims. Tom knows people throughout the territory. If there's talk about these investors, he'll hear about it." Over the next few days, the answers Barrett received were troubling. The Territorial Development Company was legitimate, but their methods were questionable. They had acquired several ranches in the region, sometimes through foreclosure, when owners couldn't meet suddenly called in loans, sometimes through sustained pressure that wore down resistance over time. More concerning was the information Tom gathered from his network of ranch hands and local businessmen. The company's previous acquisitions had not resulted in improved rail service or increased prosperity for the communities involved. Instead, the land had been subdivided and sold to speculators, leaving former ranchers displaced and local economies disrupted. "They're not bringing progress," Barrett told Clara, as they sat in the study after another reading lesson. "They're bringing upheaval for profit." Clara had taken to bringing her mending to their evening sessions, and Barrett found the quiet rhythm of her needle soothing as they talked. Her presence had transformed the study from a place of solitary struggle into something warmer, more alive. "What troubles you most about their offer?" she asked, her fingers working steadily on a torn shirt collar. Barrett considered the question seriously. "It's not just about the money, or even the land itself. This ranch represents something, a way of life, a commitment to the people who work here, to the cattle we raise, to the land we steward. Selling out to men like Hartwell feels like betraying everything I've worked to build." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand, but you also have to consider the practical realities. If they're as determined as they seem, they may find other ways to pressure you." It was a sobering thought. Barrett had dealt with rustlers, drought, harsh winters, and fluctuating cattle prices, but he had never faced organized opposition from wealthy, well-connected adversaries who operated through legal channels and financial manipulation. "I won't be driven from my own land," he said firmly, "but I'm beginning to realize I may need to be smarter about how I protect it." Clara looked up from her mending, her eyes bright with interest. "What do you mean?" "I've always operated this ranch as if it were an island, self-sufficient, independent, not needing anyone or anything beyond these boundaries. But maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I need to build alliances, strengthen relationships with other ranchers, make it harder for outsiders to pick us off one by one." It was a new way of thinking for Barrett, who had always prided himself on his independence. But Clara's presence in his life had begun to teach him the value of partnership, of sharing burdens rather than carrying them alone. "That sounds wise," Clara said softly. "Strength often comes through connection rather than isolation." Barrett looked at her, bent over her mending in the lamplight, and felt a surge of gratitude that surprised him with its intensity. Somehow, without even trying, Clara had become more than just a teacher or a housekeeper. She had become a counselor, a confidant, someone whose judgment he trusted and whose presence gave him courage. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. Clara's hands stilled on her sewing, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm glad I'm here too, Mr. McCord, more glad than I ever expected to be." The moment stretched between them, charged with emotions neither was quite ready to name. Outside, the November wind whistled through the cottonwoods, and the first winter storm clouds gathered on the horizon. But inside the study, warmth bloomed between two hearts that were slowly learning to trust again. The first snow of December brought with it more than just winter's chill. It brought rustlers. Barrett discovered the theft on a bitter morning when the ground was crusted with ice and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. 50 head of prime breeding stock had vanished from the north pasture, taken with a precision that spoke of inside knowledge and careful planning. Tom rode up as Barrett stood examining the trampled ground where the fence had been cut, his weathered face grim with anger and concern. "They knew exactly where to hit us, boss. Took the best animals and left the rest scattered to hell and gone." Barrett studied the tracks leading away from his property, noting the professional way the theft had been executed. This wasn't random opportunism. Someone's been watching us, learning our routines. As they followed the trail for several miles before losing it in the rocky terrain near Coyote Creek, Barrett felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The timing was too convenient, coming so soon after the Territorial Development Company's visit. Whether directly connected or simply emboldened by the knowledge that Barrett was under pressure, someone was testing his resolve and his ability to protect what was his. When he returned to the house, Barrett found Clara in the kitchen, her movements efficient and purposeful as she prepared the noon meal. The warmth and normalcy of the scene provided a stark contrast to the morning's grim discoveries. "How many?" Clara asked without turning around, somehow sensing the nature of his news from his expression and posture. 50 head. Prime stock worth at least $1,500. Barrett slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling every one of his 60 years. "Tom thinks it was professional work, too clean, too targeted to be casual theft." Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him, her fingers brushing his briefly as she placed it on the table. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt of warmth through him, a reminder that he was no longer facing his troubles alone. "What will you do?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Barrett wrapped his hands around the warm cup, drawing comfort from its heat. "Report it to the territorial marshal, though I don't expect much help from that quarter. Post rewards. Double the night watch. But mostly, I'll have to accept that this probably won't be the last attempt." Clara studied his face with the careful attention she had learned to give his moods and concerns. "You think this is connected to those men who wanted to buy the ranch?" "I think men like Hartwell don't take rejection well, and they understand that a rancher facing mounting losses becomes more amenable to generous offers." Barrett's voice held a bitter edge. "Whether they're directly involved or simply created an atmosphere that encourages predators, the effect is the same." That evening, as Barrett met with Tom and the senior hands to reorganize security, Clara surprised them all by appearing in the barn with a pot of coffee and her quiet, practical suggestions. She had lived through the Indian raids of her youth, she explained, and understood something about protecting what mattered most. "The house has a clear view of the north pasture," she pointed out, as they studied Barrett's hand-drawn map of the property. "If we moved the oil lamp from the parlor to the upstairs bedroom window, it would serve as a signal point for the night riders. One flash for all clear, two for trouble." Barrett looked at her with new respect. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about a lot of things since those men came calling," Clara admitted. "This ranch isn't just your livelihood, it's become my home. I have as much stake in protecting it as anyone." Her words hit Barrett harder than he expected. Somewhere in the past months, Clara had stopped being a temporary arrangement or convenient solution to his loneliness. She had become integral to his life, woven into the fabric of his daily existence in ways that made him realize how empty the ranch would feel if she were gone. Over the following weeks, Barrett implemented a careful balance of increased vigilance and normal operation. The night watch was doubled, with Clara's signal system providing communication between the house and the patrol riders. During the day, Barrett made a point of visiting neighboring ranches, sharing information about the rustling and the pressure from the development company. It was during one of these visits that Barrett learned something that changed his understanding of the situation entirely. Samuel Morrison, whose ranch bordered Barrett's to the east, had received his own visit from the Territorial Development Company, but with a significantly lower offer and hints that continued resistance might prove costly. "They're not treating us all the same," Barrett told Clara that evening as they sat before the fire in the parlor, her mending in her lap and his mother's Bible open on his knee. "Some ranchers are getting generous offers, others are getting threats, barely disguised as negotiations." Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. "What makes you different from Mr. Morrison?" Barrett had been pondering the same question. "Size, maybe. My spread is larger, more valuable. Or location, my land controls access to the best water sources in the valley." He paused, considering another possibility. "Or maybe they simply see me as more stubborn, requiring different tactics." "You are stubborn," Clara agreed with a small smile that took any sting out of the observation. "But it's the kind of stubbornness that builds something lasting rather than the kind that simply resists change." Barrett felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her words. Over the past months, Clara had shown him aspects of himself he had forgotten or never fully recognized. Through her eyes, his determination became strength rather than mere obstinacy. His loyalty to the land became stewardship rather than simple possession. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her, "about building alliances instead of standing alone. Morrison is interested in coordinating our response to these development company tactics. So are the Hendersons and the Vaughns." Clara's face brightened with approval. "That sounds wise. There's strength in unity, especially when facing opponents with superior resources." Barrett nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "The problem is, even if we stand together, we're still vulnerable to the kind of pressure these people can apply. Rustling, called-in loans, legal challenges, they have tools we can't match." Clara set down her mending and leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense with the kind of focus she brought to difficult problems. then perhaps the answer isn't to match their tools, but to find tools they can't use against you, such as community support, political connections, public attention. Clara's voice grew more confident as she developed her thoughts. Men like Hartwell operate best in shadows, through private negotiations and quiet pressure. They're vulnerable to sunlight, to having their methods exposed and questioned. Barrett stared at her, seeing his situation from an entirely new angle. You're suggesting we make this public, turn it into a territorial issue rather than a private business matter. I'm suggesting you use every advantage you have, Clara said firmly. You're not just any rancher, Barrett. You're a respected member of this community, a man who's employed dozens of families over the years, who's contributed to the stability and prosperity of this entire region. That reputation has value. It can be a weapon if you choose to use it. Barrett felt something shift inside him at her words, a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced since the troubles began. But more than that, he felt the profound impact of hearing Clara use his first name for the first time, the intimacy of it sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with business strategy. Barrett, she had called him. Not Mr. McCord, not the formal address she had maintained throughout their months together, but his given name spoken with warmth and conviction. Clara, he said softly, testing the sound of her name on his lips. Thank you. For the advice, for the support, he gestured around the warm, lived-in room, for making this place feel like home again. Clara's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to make it home. Outside, the December wind howled through the darkness, but inside the parlor, two people sat in the warm glow of firelight and lamplight, their formal barriers finally beginning to crumble into something deeper and more dangerous. The recognition that what had begun as convenience had transformed into something neither had expected to find again. The fight for the ranch was far from over, but Barrett McCord was no longer fighting alone. The discovery came by accident, as the most devastating revelations often do. Barrett had been looking for Clara's reading glasses, which she had misplaced somewhere in the house during their morning lesson. He found them in her bedroom, sitting on the small writing desk she had positioned by the window, and as he reached for them, his eye caught the edge of a letter partially hidden beneath her Bible. He wouldn't have looked. Clara's privacy was something he respected absolutely, but his own name, written in an unfamiliar hand, seemed to leap from the page. Before he could stop himself, Barrett was reading words that would shatter his understanding of everything that had passed between them. My dear Mrs. Dawson, I was most relieved to receive your letter confirming that you have successfully made contact with Mr. Barrett McCord. As I mentioned in my previous correspondence, your late son spoke of his former employer with great fondness during his final illness. Young Michael's stories of Mr. McCord's unexpected kindness to a mere ranch hand clearly made a profound impression on you. Barrett's hands began to shake as he continued reading, the carefully penned words blurring before his eyes as their meaning became clear. Clara had not come to him through the matrimonial agency as she had claimed. She had sought him out deliberately, armed with knowledge of his character gained through her dying son's grateful recollections of his time working the McCord ranch. The letter continued, outlining Clara's plan to present herself as a mail-order bride. Her belief that a man who had shown such unexpected compassion to a dying boy might offer her the companionship and security she desperately needed. The matrimonial agency had been merely a convenient fiction, a way to arrange the meeting without revealing her true motivations. Barrett sank into Clara's chair, the letter trembling in his hands as memories crashed over him like floodwater. Michael Dawson, he remembered the boy now. 17 years old, thin and coughing, who had worked for him briefly 3 summers ago. Barrett had found him collapsed in the barn one scorching July day, burning with fever and too proud to admit he was ill. Instead of sending him away, Barrett had moved the boy into the bunkhouse, had Maria tend to him, had paid for the doctor who confirmed what they all suspected: consumption, advanced and fatal. Barrett had kept Michael on the payroll for the remaining weeks of his life, giving him light duties when he could work and a comfortable place to rest when he couldn't. When the boy died, Barrett had paid for a proper burial and had written a letter to the boy's mother, expressing his condolences and enclosing Michael's final wages, plus enough money to help with funeral expenses. He had thought little of it at the time, simply what any decent man would do for a dying boy far from home. But apparently, that simple act of human kindness had meant everything to a grieving mother, enough to drive her across half a continent to seek out the man who had shown her son compassion in his final days. Barrett heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly replaced the letter where he had found it, but his hands continued to shake as Clara appeared in the doorway, her face brightening when she saw him. "Oh, you found my glasses, thank you, Barrett. I was beginning to think I'd have to feel my way through today's lesson." She paused, her smile fading as she took in his expression. "Is something wrong? You look quite pale." Barrett stood abruptly, the glasses falling from his nerveless fingers to clatter on the wooden floor. "I need some air," he said roughly, pushing past her toward the door. "Barrett, wait!" Clara called after him, but he was already striding down the hallway, his boots echoing against the hardwood like gunshots. He found himself in the barn, standing among the horses and hay bales, breathing hard as if he had run a great distance. The familiar smells of leather and horsehair did nothing to calm the storm raging in his chest, a mixture of betrayal, humiliation, and something else he couldn't quite name. She had lied to him. For months, Clara had maintained the fiction that their meeting was a matter of chance, of mutual convenience, arranged through a matrimonial service. She had listened to his stories, shared his meals, taught him to read, allowed him to believe that she was learning to care for him as he was learning to care for her. But it had all been based on deception, on knowledge gained through her son's deathbed revelations about a lonely rancher who might be susceptible to the ministrations of a skilled and desperate woman. Barrett slammed his fist against a support beam, welcoming the sharp pain that shot through his knuckles. How could he have been so naive? How could he have believed that a woman like Clara would choose him for himself, that their growing closeness was genuine rather than calculated? The barn door opened behind him, and Clara's voice cut through his anguish like a blade. "Barrett, please, let me explain." He turned to face her, and the hope in her eyes only fueled his anger. "Explain what exactly? How you lied to me from the moment you stepped off that stage? How everything between us has been built on deception?" Clara's face went white, but she stepped closer, her hands outstretched in supplication. "It wasn't deception, not the way you think. Yes, I came here knowing about your kindness to Michael, but—" "Your son," Barrett said flatly. "Michael Dawson was your son, the boy who died in my bunkhouse 3 years ago. You came here because of him, not because of any matrimonial service." Clara's composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Michael was my son, but Barrett, please understand, I didn't come here to trick you or use you. I came because I was desperate and alone, and my dying boy told me stories about a man who showed him more kindness than he had ever known from a stranger." "So you decided to prey on that kindness," Barrett said harshly, "to present yourself as something you weren't in order to gain access to my home, my life." "No," Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "I came here hoping to find the man Michael described, yes, but I stayed because of who you are, not because of what you could give me. Everything that's grown between us, the lessons, the conversations, the way you've begun to trust again, none of that was calculated or false." Barrett wanted to believe her, but the betrayal cut too deep. "How can I trust anything you say now? How do I know what's real and what's performance?" Clara stepped closer, her eyes blazing with desperate sincerity. "Because you know me, Barrett. You've seen me at my most honest moments, when I'm teaching you to read, when I'm mending your clothes, when I'm sitting beside you in the evenings, talking about our shared grief. You've seen the real me, not some fiction I created to deceive you." "Have I?" Barrett's voice was cold as winter wind. "Or have I seen exactly what you wanted me to see? A lonely widow in need of rescue, someone who would be grateful for my protection and ask for nothing more than the privilege of serving me." The words hit Clara like physical blows, and she staggered backward as if struck. Is that really what you think of me? That I'm some scheming woman who would fake affection to secure a comfortable home? Barrett's anger faltered slightly at the genuine pain in her voice, but he held onto it like armor against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm him. I don't know what to think anymore. I thought I knew you, but it turns out I don't know you at all. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. You know what, Barrett? You're right. You don't know me. If you did, you would understand that a woman who has buried a husband and a child doesn't play games with people's hearts. You would know that someone who has faced real loss doesn't treat affection as a commodity to be traded for security. She turned toward the door, then paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Michael told me about your kindness during his final weeks, yes. But he also told me about your loneliness, about how you ate your meals alone and seemed to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. I didn't come here to deceive you, Barrett. I came here because two broken people sometimes can heal each other if they're brave enough to try. As Clara walked away, leaving Barrett alone among the horses and shadows, he was forced to confront a truth that was perhaps more terrifying than any deception. Clara May Dawson had indeed come to him under false pretenses, but the feelings that had grown between them, the warmth, the companionship, the slowly blooming love, those had been genuine from both sides. The question now was whether he was brave enough to forgive her lies in order to embrace the truth of what they had built together, or whether his wounded pride would cost him the best thing that had happened to him in 13 lonely years. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the first drops of a cold December rain began to fall on the McCord ranch, washing the dust from the air, but doing nothing to cleanse the hurt from Barrett's heart. For 3 days after the confrontation in the barn, Barrett and Clara moved around each other like wounded animals, maintaining the basic civilities of shared living while avoiding any real communication. Clara continued to prepare meals and tend to household duties, but the easy warmth that had characterized their interactions was replaced by a careful politeness that felt more painful than outright hostility. Barrett threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that worried his men. He rode fence lines in the bitter cold, worked with the cattle long past necessity, and spent his evenings in his study with ledgers and correspondence rather than continuing the reading lessons that had become such a cherished part of their routine. On the 4th morning, Barrett discovered Clara in the kitchen packing her few belongings into the same weathered suitcase she had carried when she first arrived. The sight hit him like a physical blow, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. Clara didn't look up from her careful folding. "I think it's best if I leave, Barrett. I've written to the stage company. There's a coach through to Santa Fe on Friday. I'll be ready." Barrett poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "Running away seems to be your solution to difficult situations." The barb hit its mark, and Clara's hands stilled on the blue dress she was folding. "I'm not running away. I'm acknowledging that my presence here has become more harmful than helpful. You can't trust me, and I can't bear to see you look at me like I'm something distasteful." "Maybe that's what you are," Barrett said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Maybe I was a fool to think otherwise." Clara finally looked up, and Barrett was shocked by the pain in her eyes. "Maybe you were," she agreed quietly, "but I never asked you to be a fool, Barrett. I asked you to be yourself, the kind man who showed mercy to a dying boy, who was willing to learn new things at 60 years old, who was brave enough to let someone care about him again." Barrett felt something crack inside his chest, but he held onto his anger like a shield. "Built on lies." "Built on hope," Clara corrected. "Hope that grew into something real regardless of how it started." She returned to her packing, and Barrett found himself watching her economical movements, remembering how those same hands had guided his fingers across the pages of his mother's Bible, how they had mended his clothes and prepared his meals and created a warmth in his house that he hadn't known he was missing. That afternoon, Barrett rode out to the small cemetery on the hill where his 2 wives lay buried. The December wind whipped across the graves, rattling the bare branches of the cottonwood tree he had planted years ago to provide shade for the headstones. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, trying to sort through the confusion in his heart. "I don't know what to do," he said aloud, addressing the graves of Margaret and Sarah. "She lied to me from the beginning, but she made me feel alive again. She came here for the wrong reasons, but she stayed for the right ones." The wind was his only answer, but somehow standing there among the markers of his past loves helped him begin to see his situation more clearly. Margaret and Sarah were gone, their love given and received in its time, now preserved only in memory. Clara was here, alive and warm and real, offering a different kind of loved one, seasoned by loss and matured by understanding. As the sun began to set, Barrett made his way back to the house, his mind churning with thoughts and possibilities. He found Clara in the parlor, her packed suitcase by the door, reading quietly by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded but hopeful. "I've been thinking," Barrett said, settling into his usual chair across from her, "about what you said, about Michael." Clara closed her book, giving him her full attention. "What about him? Tell me about him. About what kind of boy he was, what he meant to you." Barrett's voice was gentler than it had been in days. "Help me understand why his stories about me mattered enough to bring you across half the country." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she began to speak, her voice soft with memory. "Michael was everything good in my world after his father died. 17 years old, but with an old soul and a worker's hands, he took on the responsibility of caring for me when he should have been courting girls and planning his own future." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "When the consumption took hold, he knew he was dying, but he never complained. Instead, he told me stories to keep my spirits up, stories about the places he'd worked, the people he'd met. But the stories about your ranch were different. He talked about you with something close to reverence." Barrett shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything special, just treated him decent." "That's exactly what made it special," Clara said firmly. "Michael had worked for men who saw hired hands as expendable, who wouldn't waste time or money on someone who couldn't pull their weight. But you saw a sick boy and chose kindness over profit. You gave him dignity in his dying, Barrett. Do you have any idea how precious that gift was to his mother?" Barrett felt his carefully maintained anger beginning to crumble under the weight of Clara's words. "So you came here looking for the man from his stories?" "I came here desperate and alone, carrying grief so heavy I could barely breathe," Clara admitted. "Michael's stories gave me hope that somewhere in this harsh world was a man capable of unexpected goodness. I thought maybe, just maybe, such a man might have room in his life for a woman who understood loss." "And when you met me?" Clara's smile was tremulous but genuine. "I found exactly the man Michael described, but also so much more. I found someone who was fighting his own battles with loneliness and loss. I found someone who was brave enough to admit he couldn't read and humble enough to let me teach him. I found someone who was worth loving, not because my son told me stories, but because of who you proved yourself to be." Barrett studied her face in the lamplight, seeing again the woman who had sat patiently through countless reading lessons, who had brought life back to his empty house, who had faced down cattle rustlers and development company threats with quiet courage. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning," he said finally. "Yes," Clara agreed. "I should have, but I was afraid you would turn me away if you knew I had come seeking you specifically. I was afraid you would think I was trying to take advantage of your kindness to Michael." "Weren't you?" Clara met his eyes directly. "I was hoping to benefit from it, yes. But Barrett, if you had turned out to be anything less than the man I hoped you were, I would have left on the first stage, out. I stayed because you were everything Michael said and more. I stayed because you needed someone to care about you, as much as I needed someone to care about." Barrett rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "How do I know that anything between us has been real? How do I know you haven't been playing a part this whole time?" Clara's voice was steady when she answered. "Because you know me, Barrett. You've seen me when I thought you weren't watching, humming while I cooked, crying over a letter from home, laughing at something you said. You've felt my hands shake when you stood too close, seen me blush when you complimented my cooking. Those responses can't be faked, not for months on end." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I'm leaving, if I were truly the scheming woman you think I am, I would be fighting harder to stay, wouldn't I? I would be trying to manipulate your guilt or your loneliness. Instead, I'm walking away because I can't bear to see you doubt everything we've built together." Barrett turned back to face her, and for the first time in days, he really looked at her, not through the lens of his anger and betrayal, but with the eyes of a man who had learned to care deeply for this woman over the past months. He saw the exhaustion in her posture, the sadness in her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting another blow. "Clara," he said softly, and at the sound of her name spoken without anger, she looked up with desperate hope. "Yes?" Barrett crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were cold, and he realized she had been sitting alone in the chilly parlor for hours, probably afraid to make herself too comfortable in a house she believed she was leaving. "I've been a fool," he said simply. "Not for trusting you, but for letting my pride matter more than my heart. You came here for the wrong reasons, but you stayed for the right ones. You gave me back my ability to read. But more than that, you gave me back my ability to hope." Clara's tears flowed freely now. "Barrett, I'm so sorry I deceived you. I never meant to hurt you." "I know," Barrett said, and he realized he truly did know. "I know because I've watched you care for me these past months. I've seen your patience when I struggled with letters, your pride when I succeeded. I felt your hand on my forehead when I was sick, heard you humming while you worked, seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching." He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. A woman who was only pretending to care wouldn't put that much of herself into the pretense. Clara looked at him through her tears, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Does this mean you asking me to stay?" Barrett smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in days. "I'm asking you to stay and marry me, Clara May Dawson. Not because of some mail-order arrangement, not because of convenience or loneliness, but because I love you, because you've made me believe in tomorrow again." Clara's suitcase sat forgotten by the door as she threw her arms around Barrett's neck, both of them crying and laughing in equal measure. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear December sky, bearing witness to the healing of two wounded hearts, brave enough to choose love over fear. The sound of hoofbeats thundering up the ranch road shattered the tender reunion between Barrett and Clara. Through the parlor window, they could see Tom Martinez riding hard toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat despite the December cold. Behind him, an orange glow painted the night sky in the direction of the north pasture. Barrett was on his feet instantly, his arms still around Clara, but his attention focused on the approaching crisis. "Fire," he said grimly, recognizing the signs even before Tom reached the porch. Tom burst through the front door without ceremony, his hat in his hands and his face streaked with soot. "Boss, they hit us again, but worse this time. Burned out the line shack and stampeded the cattle. We've got animals scattered from here to Kingdom Come, and the grasslands still burning." Barrett felt Clara's hands tighten on his arms, but when he looked down at her, he saw not fear but determination in her eyes. "Go," she said firmly. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you get back." Barrett grabbed his coat and hat, but paused at the door to look back at Clara. "This isn't coincidence. The timing—" "I know," Clara said quietly, "but we'll deal with that after you've saved what can be saved. Go." Barrett and Tom rode hard through the frigid night, joined by ranch hands from all directions as they converged on the disaster. The scene that greeted them was worse than Barrett had imagined. The line shacker, simple structure that provided shelter for hands working the far reaches of the property, was a smoking ruin. More than 100 head of cattle were scattered across miles of countryside, spooked by the fire and the men who had deliberately driven them into panic. "How many men?" Barrett asked as he surveyed the damage. "At least 6, maybe 8, replied Jake Morrison, one of the younger hands. "They came in fast and professional, boss." set the fire, drove the cattle, and disappeared into the night like ghosts. Barrett dismounted and walked through the ruins of the line shack, his boots crunching on charred wood and ash. This wasn't random destruction, it was a message. Someone wanted him to understand that his property, his livelihood, his very way of life could be destroyed at will. "Tom," Barrett called, his voice carrying across the smoky air, "send Jake and Billy to start gathering the scattered cattle. Take Rodriguez and check the south boundary, make sure this is the only hit. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." As the men dispersed to assess the damage and begin recovery efforts, Barrett found himself standing alone in the circle of destruction, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. 30 years of building, of careful stewardship, of creating something lasting, and it could all be undone by men whose only loyalty was to profit. But even as anger burned in his chest, Barrett felt something else, a strange sense of clarity. Standing in the ruins of the line shack, he realized that this attack wasn't just about land or money. It was about fear that a man like Barrett McCord, with his integrity and his stubborn refusal to be bought or intimidated, represented a threat to those who preferred to operate in shadows. The work of gathering scattered cattle and assessing damage continued through the night and into the following day. Barrett pushed himself and his men hard, driven by the need to restore order and demonstrate that the McCord Ranch would not be broken by cowardly attacks. But as the sun climbed toward noon, Barrett found himself thinking not just about cattle and boundaries, but about the woman waiting for him at the house. Clara had faced her own kind of destruction, the loss of her husband and son, the collapse of the life she had built. But she had found the courage to start over, to take the risk of reaching out to a stranger based on nothing more than hope and a dead boy's stories. Her deception about the circumstances of their meeting seemed insignificant compared to the courage it had taken to leave everything familiar and seek a new beginning with a man she had never met. It was mid-afternoon when Barrett finally returned to the house, exhausted and covered with soot, but grimly satisfied that the immediate crisis was under control. He found Clara in the kitchen, preparing what looked like enough food to feed an army. "For the men," she explained without him asking. "They'll be hungry and tired when they come in, and they'll need something hot and substantial." Barrett washed his hands and face at the kitchen pump, watching Clara move efficiently around the familiar space. Even in the midst of crisis, she was thinking of others, anticipating needs, and meeting them with quiet competence. "How bad?" Clara asked, as she ladled stew into a large pot. "Bad enough," Barrett admitted, "but not fatal. We'll recover the cattle, rebuild the line shack. The real question is what comes next." Clara paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "What do you mean?" Barrett dried his hands slowly, considering his words carefully. "This wasn't random, Clara. The timing, coming right after our reconciliation, suggests someone's been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Someone wants me broken and desperate enough to accept that development company's offer." Clara set down her ladle and faced him fully. "What will you do?" Barrett looked at this woman who had brought such unexpected light into his life, who had faced her own losses with courage and grace, who was now standing beside him as he faced the greatest threat to everything he had built. In her eyes, he saw not just love, but partnership, the recognition that whatever came next, they would face it together. "I'm going to fight," Barrett said simply, "but not the way they expect." Barrett's plan unfolded over the next 3 days with the careful precision of a military campaign. Instead of responding to the attacks with increased isolation or desperate acceptance of the development company's offer, he did something his opponents hadn't expected. He made the conflict public. Working with Clara by his side, Barrett composed letters to every major newspaper in the territory, to territorial officials, and to fellow ranchers throughout New Mexico. Clara's teaching had given him the confidence to put his thoughts into words, and her insight helped him frame the issue not as a personal business dispute, but as a threat to the entire way of life that had built the territory. "Read this back to me," Barrett said, passing Clara the letter he had painstakingly written to the Santa Fe territorial representative. His handwriting was still labored, each letter carefully formed, but the words were his own. Clara took the paper, her eyes scanning the neat script that represented months of patient learning. "Dear Congressman Martinez," she read aloud, "I write to inform you of serious criminal activities being conducted against law-abiding ranchers in our territory by a group calling itself the Territorial Development Company. Through arson, cattle theft, and systematic intimidation, these men are attempting to force legitimate landowners to sell their property for far less than market value." She continued reading Barrett's careful documentation of the attacks, his research into the company's methods in other regions, and his call for territorial intervention to protect property rights and maintain law and order. "It's excellent, Barrett," Clara said when she finished. "Clear, factual, and compelling. This isn't the writing of an uneducated rancher. This is the voice of a respected community leader, demanding justice." Barrett felt a surge of pride at her words, not just in his improved literacy, but in what they were accomplishing together. "Think it will work?" "I think men like Hartwell aren't used to having their methods exposed to public scrutiny," Clara replied. "They depend on operating in shadows, on isolated victims who feel they have nowhere to turn. You're taking away their primary advantage." The response to Barrett's letters exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The territorial newspaper ran a front-page story about the development company's tactics, interviewing other ranchers who had faced similar pressure. Congressman Martinez sent a telegram promising a full investigation. Most importantly, neighboring ranchers began reaching out to coordinate their resistance to the company's tactics. It was Tom who brought word that their strategy was working. "Boss," he said, entering Barrett's study where Barrett and Clara were working on correspondence, "we just had visitors. 3 men from the Territorial Development Company, but not the same ones as before." Barrett looked up from the letter he was writing. "What did they want?" "To make a new offer," Tom said with a grin. $50,000 for the ranch, and they seemed mighty eager to close the deal quick. Also seemed real nervous about something, kept looking over their shoulders like they expected the law to show up any minute. Barrett and Clara exchanged glances. The increased offer confirmed what they had suspected: the company's position was weakening under public scrutiny. "What did you tell them?" Barrett asked. "Told them you were busy with important correspondence and couldn't be disturbed," Tom replied. "But boss, I don't think they're going to give up easy. Desperate men do desperate things." Barrett nodded grimly. He had expected the fight to intensify before it ended. "Double the watch tonight. And Tom, make sure the men know that if anyone wants to leave until this is settled, there'll be no hard feelings. I won't ask them to risk their lives for my fight." "Already talked to the boys," Tom said with obvious pride. "Every last one of them is staying. You've been good to us over the years, boss. Time we returned the favor." That evening, as Barrett and Clara sat before the fire in the parlor, Barrett pulled out a piece of paper he had been working on in private. His handwriting was still careful and deliberate, but the words flowed with new confidence. "I wrote something for you," he said, offering Clara the paper with hands that trembled slightly. "It's not much, but I wanted you to know." Clara took the paper, her eyes widening as she recognized what it was: a letter addressed to her, written entirely in Barrett's own hand. "My dear Clara," she read aloud, her voice soft with emotion, "I am not a man who has ever been good with words, spoken or written. But you have given me the gift of letters, and I want to use that gift to tell you what you mean to me. You came into my life when I had given up on happiness, when I believed that a man my age had used up his chances for love. You taught me to read, but more than that, you taught me to hope again. You have made my house a home, my meals a pleasure, my evenings a joy. If you will have me, Clara May Dawson, I would be honored to call you my wife. Not because of loneliness or convenience, but because I love you with all the heart I thought had died years ago. Forever yours, Barrett McCord." Clara looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Barrett, it's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever written to me." Barrett reached for her hands, feeling the calluses from years of work, seeing the lines that spoke of sorrows faced and overcome. "Is that a yes?" Clara's smile was radiant through her tears. "That's a yes, Barrett McCord. Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we're brave enough to build together." Outside, the winter wind howled across the ranch, but inside the parlor, two hearts that had found each other against all odds began planning for a future that would be theirs to shape together. 3 months later, on a warm April morning, when the desert was painted with wildflowers and the air carried the sweet promise of spring, Barrett McCord stood in his parlor adjusting his collar with hands that shook only slightly with nervousness. Through the window, he could see the first buds appearing on the peach trees. Clara had insisted on planting 6 young saplings that had survived their first winter and were now reaching toward the sun with the stubborn optimism that characterized everything Clara brought into his life. The Territorial Development Company had withdrawn from the region 2 weeks after the territorial investigation began, their methods exposed and their backing withdrawn by nervous investors who preferred their profit-making to remain invisible. Hartwell and his associates had simply vanished one night, leaving behind a trail of questionable contracts and a newly awakened community of ranchers who had learned the value of standing together. Barrett's ranch had not only survived the attacks, but prospered in their aftermath. The publicity surrounding their resistance had attracted new markets for their cattle, and Barrett's reputation as a principled man who couldn't be bought or intimidated had opened doors throughout the territory. More importantly, the crisis had forged bonds with neighboring ranchers that promised to benefit the entire region for years to come. But today wasn't about business or community standing. Today was about something far more precious and personal. "You clean up remarkably well for an old cowboy," Clara said from the doorway, her voice warm with affection and gentle teasing. Barrett turned to face his bride and felt his breath catch in his throat. Clara wore a simple dress of blue silk, not white, as they were both too seasoned for such pretenses, but the color brought out her eyes and complemented the silver in her hair. She had woven wildflowers into a simple bouquet, and her face glowed with the kind of happiness that made her look years younger. "You're beautiful," Barrett said simply, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Clara blushed like a young girl, even as she reached up to straighten his tie with the familiar gesture of a woman who had been caring for him for months. "Are you ready for this, Barrett? Ready to be stuck with a stubborn woman who will probably continue to rearrange your house and insist on reading lessons even after we're married?" Barrett captured her hands in his, marveling at how right they felt there. "I'm ready to promise you the rest of my life, Clara May Dawson. Ready to plant trees with you and watch them grow. Ready to read bedtime stories to you when we're both too old to see the pages clearly. Ready to face whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." The ceremony was simple, held in the parlor with Tom Martinez and Maria serving as witnesses, and conducted by the circuit preacher who had made a special trip from Santa Fe. Barrett had insisted on writing his own vows, and when the time came, he pulled out a piece of paper covered with his careful handwriting. "Clara," he read, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "you came into my life like spring rain after a long drought. You didn't just teach me to read words on a page, you taught me to read the language of hope again. You made me believe that a man's best years don't have to be behind him, that love can bloom at any season if we're brave enough to tend it." He paused, looking up from his notes to meet her eyes. "I promise to be the man your son saw in me, kind, patient, worthy of the trust you've placed in my hands. I promise to plant trees with you and trust in tomorrow. I promise to love you not just for today, but for all the days we're given, however many or few they may be." Clara's own vows, spoken without notes but from the heart, brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. She promised to continue believing in Barrett's goodness, to stand beside him through whatever challenges life might bring, and to never stop seeing the wonder in simple things like fresh peach blossoms and evening reading lessons. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Barrett kissed Clara with the gentle reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of second chances. Around them, the house that had been silent for so many years seemed to sing with joy and possibility. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. The ranch hands had prepared a feast in the main dining room, and neighboring ranchers and their families had come to wish the newlyweds well. Barrett found himself surrounded by a community he had helped to forge through crisis, by people who respected not just his success but his character. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Barrett and Clara found themselves alone on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The night was warm and still, filled with the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of coyotes in the hills. "Any regrets?" Barrett asked, his arm around Clara's shoulders as they rocked gently in the chairs he had positioned to face the young orchard. Clara leaned into his warmth, her head resting against his shoulder. "Only that it took us so long to find each other. And maybe that Michael isn't here to see how right he was about you." Barrett pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of the wildflowers she still wore in her hair. "He is here, Clara. In the courage you showed by coming to me, in the faith you had that two broken people could heal each other. He's here in every tree we plant and every dream we dare to dream." Clara tilted her face up to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Barrett McCord. Not because my son told me stories about your kindness, but because you proved those stories were just the beginning of who you really are." "And I love you, Clara McCord," Barrett replied, savoring the sound of her new name, "for teaching me that it's never too late to learn something new, whether it's reading words on a page or opening your heart to love again." As they sat together in the comfortable silence that comes to couples who have learned to communicate in more than words, the peach trees Clara had insisted on planting rustled gently in the evening breeze. The blossoms were just beginning to show small white flowers that promised fruit in seasons to come, symbols of faith in tomorrow and the enduring power of hope to transform even the most barren landscape into something beautiful and fruitful. In the distance, the lights of other ranch houses twinkled like earthbound stars, reminders of the community they had helped to build and the connections that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. Barrett McCord was no longer the isolated, lonely man who had ordered a mail-order bride out of desperation. He was a husband, a partner, a leader in his community, and a man who had learned that the best chapters of life could be written at any age, as long as one had the courage to pick up the pen and begin.